The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
You and I have, over the years, we've kind of talked about the fact that there's this weird period of time where there were hijackings in the U.S. And I realized there's one guy we've kind of talked about here and there, particularly with the holiday stories, because he kind of overlaps in between them. But I was just telling you, like, every time I read this guy's story, I find something else like crazy about it. So I'm including like a version of that story where like there's sort of multiple avenues that we go down. And you know, I never know like how to tell this version of it. So I figured I'd just
wing it.
Yeah, like wing it. I've got a bunch of the articles open, and I've outlined like kind of the direction I wanted to go. But this is one of those. I think if people are listening to it and they're like, "Oh, this sounds familiar," we do mention this when we were talking about Angela Davis, who was like a part of some of the insanity that goes on related to this story. But I thought we'd talk about sort of what leads to TWA Flight 541, which that's a hijacking. And I guess when I think about it, like in terms of a hijacking, it's almost always a hostage taking of some kind.
Well, it is just by the nature of it, I guess. Now, like I guess a carjack isn't a hijack, right?
Not technically.
Okay, because I was going to say sometimes in carjacking, like they just make people get out of the car, right?
Right.
But like hijacking on a plane, by its very nature, they are in control of the plane and therefore in control of all the people on the plane.
Right.
And that's the hostage situation, right?
Yeah. And there was this time period between 1968 and 1972 where the idea of being taken hostage in the air was a very real thing. And a lot of that happens like when the U.S. and Cuba are sort of going at it. So like Cuba-bound hijackings for some reason were like a huge deal. So we have to talk about that like a little bit. And then there's one person that's sort of at the center of all of this. But I wanted to sort of mention those type hijackings, come back to 541 and the origin story, which we've covered at one point.
Right. And I would just like to say, so, you know, we're doing hostage situations for the holidays, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, hostage taking is a very interesting concept, right?
It is.
Because it's ultimately it's some variation of, you know, one or more people trying to get something, even if it's just to be heard, right?
Yes.
By essentially putting other people in at least a perceived peril, right?
Yes.
And it's one of the truly horrifying things that any person could face in life, because you're never prepared for it, right?
I would say yes. Like it just happens, at least for the people who end up being the hostages, it happens out of nowhere.
Exactly. And then they've, you know, even the highest level concept of hostage situations is, in my opinion, it's on a shaky foundation because you basically, maybe not always a lunatic, but most of the time it's going to be a lunatic wanting something crazy.
Yeah.
And your life hangs in the balance. That's how I look at it.
I would agree with that.
It's not a well thought out plan, right?
Yeah.
Because even if it's some semblance of, nobody's ever successful, right? I mean, hostage situations always go wrong. And I don't know of anybody who's ever actually gotten what they wanted out of it. And so our human brains say, well, that wouldn't be the way to do that now, would it? Except some, people were still doing it. We have less and less of them now.
We do. And that was one of the things I found interesting. So between about 1955 and 1987, there are literally hundreds of air hijackings. But they really peak and sort of end around the end of 1972. Like after 1972, you kind of hear about them sporadically. I tracked about 8 during the 1980s. And then during the 1990s, I was able to track 5. So this is not a completely comprehensive number.
Right. And then after, of course, like sort of the ultimate hostage situation with 9/11.
There's 5. To today, there's about 5 that affect like U.S. airplanes.
Right. And so there's been after 9/11, there were substantial changes made to airline travel, right?
Yes.
And they made them pretty much, I think, impossible. I can actually remember being on airplanes and having things that I probably should have never had. Not that I was going to do anything with them, right? It just changed. Like during our lifetime, it evolved severely.
Yeah, I remember a time when like a pocket knife, a lighter, and various other things that you would keep, were kind of tool-like. I mean, I remember having a Leatherman, like the little folding sort of multi-purpose tool, like in my carry-on, and nobody said anything. And like one of the fold-outs on that was a knife. But now, today, that would never happen. In fact, there's a big bin of those.
My husband has lost quite a few of his he would never take like a weapon knife on a plane, but you can't even take like an instrument knife on a plane. And he's lost several of them. Because he's just forgotten. I have an interesting memory of right before 9/11. It was in August of 2001. I happened to go on a plane trip, and I did my nails on the plane.
So you had like the nail file on little scissors, all that?
Nail polish, nail file, acetone remover. Like I had all of it, right?
Interesting.
And of course, you couldn't do that afterwards, but that's one of my memories was that. Oh, and the funniest part was that, like, the flight attendant was like, do you have any nail polish? And like, because she had a run in her hose, which is hilarious. But so that's one of my memories that I really think about because I would never have gotten through security now with all that stuff.
Yeah. And I remember I had this one weird job a long time ago, and I would fly back and forth between 2 locations. One of the people at the job was very into like firing odd weapons, big guns and whatnot. And he had given me a bullet, and that bullet was like, I don't remember exactly what caliber or what gun we were shooting, but he had given me it was a live round of ammunition. And it was a large one, probably, I want to say at least like a .223 round, but maybe larger than that. And it was in my pocket, and somehow I flew all the way back to my home airport, and like it never came up at all. It was like in my jacket pocket. Jacket went off and into a bin and through the machine and blah, blah, blah. And somehow, as I was getting back into my car, that bullet was in the pocket, and I was like, oh, wow, I just flew all this way. And
but that was before 9/11.
That was prior to 9/11. Yeah,
okay.
That was like a year before 9/11.
This is probably a dumb question. Can anything happen to a bullet if it doesn't have a weapon that can discharge it?
Not really. I mean, they're
okay. Like you could set it on fire or something, right?
Oh, I mean, you could make a bullet without a gun, you could like strike a. It's just dangerous. Like you could strike a bullet in a way that it like went off.
But it would be. I was just
You
curious.
would hurt yourself, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like the main way that bullets work in terms of like just ballistics is like you have a series of things that even though they're not part of the bullet, they're making the bullet's action like a forward projectile, like the barrel and the mechanisms that are enclosed for firing. All of those things working together is what makes the bullet really dangerous and like a lethal weapon. The bullet itself is sort of a pyrotechnic otherwise.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Like it could explode, but it wouldn't necessarily be what you were thinking.
Right.
So I pulled like a few of those hijackings to talk about. But specifically, we're going to come back to 541 here in just a second. So it's interesting. One of the like earliest documented hijackings that's like sort of before the Cuban Revolution is April 9th, 1958. That is a Douglas DC-3 that's piloted by Armando Piedra and Ramon Vasquez. And it's a Cubana de Aviación flight. It's hijacked en route from the Havana airport, headed over to the Santa Clara airport, and it ends up going into Mexico. So, like, this is considered to be the first hijacking that takes place in the Western Hemisphere, April 9th, 1958. It actually lands in Mexico, and I had to like look it up on a map, and I was like, what are they doing there? So I pulled up a little information, and they did not keep like records of this hijacking I mean, you could find them now, but at the time, they were just like, you know, this is the documented path, motive unknown. And then they didn't like put down the hijacker's name. They didn't say how many passengers or any of that. It's a Douglas DC-3, and it's a pretty, like, in terms of like aircrafts today, like what we think of, it's a relatively small plane. It's like I always think of it as being the plane from Casablanca. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm not 100% sure that it's exactly that plane because there's various versions of it built since then. But it is one of those planes that I guess at the time would have been really common, even though most of them were built in the 40s. They certainly still would have been common in Cuba, and I always think of Cuba as having, you know, old cars and older equipment. There's like almost 1,000 variants of this airplane, but what I picture is that plane for that being the first hijacking, and that feels kind of apropos, like that it's something that is almost from an old movie. The next recorded hijacking is April 12th, 1958, on the same path, 3 days later. Same type of plane. 12 passengers are on board that plane. And instead of going Havana to Santa Clara, which all would be in Cuba, this one makes its way to Miami, Florida. And like, according to press reports from 1958, halfway into this flight, like, the people on board decided, well, we're going to defect to the U.S. So that's how we end up with, you know, is it a hijacking? Is it a defection flight? I think you tell whatever story you have to tell to kind of keep moving. And that's what these first three hijackings appear to be, because the next one takes place the next day. And that's April 13th, 1958. Same DC-3 aircraft. And it's hijacked, but this time it's hijacked by the crew. So the crew hijacked the captain, and again, they fly into Miami.
So they were just deporting themselves.
So, yeah, that's what I was going to say. So these being the first three Western Hemisphere hijackings, because that's how it's documented. In my opinion, that's a completely different thing than if you don't give us money, we're going to kill these people by crashing this plane. Does that make sense?
Well, right, but it also is a hostage situation because, like, all those people went to Miami whether they wanted to or not.
Right. And so...
I have a hard time wrapping my head around what it would have been like in 1958. I have no idea. Like flying and stuff,
Right.
It would be a lot different. And it's almost like, see, I'm not really exactly sure what was happening, but it's almost like when the crew did it, like they were just taking stock from what I assume it was like political issues, like either pro Castro, anti Castro, something like that. And then the crew was like, hey, we could do that to move to Miami, right?
Yeah, ultimately, yes.
And so it was almost like they were feeding off of one another in a way.
Well, they are. So those first 3 hijackings take place in April, but by November 1958, we have our first big, and I'm not minimizing the fact that those are hijackings. I'm just saying they had a different purpose. Like you just said, like there's a political element to it that's not violent.
But it's still taking people
It is
hostage.
taking people hostage. So that's April 9th, April 12th, April 13th. But by November, Flight 495, which is a different kind of plane, by the way. And the reason I say that is because it's still a big turboprop plane, but it's a Vickers Viscount, larger plane. It actually is coming out of Miami, and it was supposed to be headed over to a resort called Veradero. So while it's on its way, it's suddenly hijacked by Cuban militants. So it's doing the opposite of the first 3. And these hijackers had it in their mind they were going to land in eastern Cuba. And what nobody realized at the time is they had apparently loaded up the plane's underbelly with weapons. So November 1st, 1958, Flight 495, this is our first big, there's something happening. Now, still tied to the political climate in Cuba, and it's just ahead of the Cuban Revolution. So this plane is ultimately going to deliver to Fidel Castro at that time because he's about to take over. But you got to think he's not the leader yet. He's going to be the leader in a couple months. They're trying to take the rebels' weapons, but as night approaches, the plane runs out of fuel. It's overshot like how far it could have gone. Because if what I'm reading is correct, my guess is they were going to stop in Veradero and refuel and then go on to Havana if it's the normal flight. But they push it too far, meaning the hijackers, and they try for an emergency landing at this location known as the Preston Sugar Mill. But the plane does not make it into the sugar mill. And instead, it ends up landing in the ocean and it breaks apart. There's only 6 survivors of this flight. It kills most of the passengers and most of the crew. And the stories that we get about that, we're not going to get full understanding of what happened on that flight until the early 2000s.
Right. And then it's had the test of time, I guess. I mean, then it's so much later. And, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but in 1958, that is, I believe, the year the FAA was the beginning of it.
Yeah, and I don't think that the FAA came about because of the Cuban side of this. And I will say it was created in August of 1958, but it was replacing the Civil Aeronautics Administration. And largely it was being brought about because they needed a way, as air traffic expanded, to keep track of everything that was happening in the sky.
Exactly. They had a forward-thinking view of how it was going to become like a commercial industry, right?
Right.
Like a more commercialized industry. I don't know I've never really studied the history of how many people actually flew way back then, right?
Right.
But it wasn't like it is now.
Well, yeah.
The people who died on the November hijack plane, I don't know the exact number, but we're not talking about hundreds. It was more like probably like 20.
I think it was 15. I think 15 people died, and the hijacker and 14 passengers and crew.
Right. And, so, okay, that would make sense because that would make about 21 people on the plane total.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the size plane you're looking at.
Yeah, it's a small plane.
Right.
I will say, so the FAA comes about because of, and I don't know the name of the act off my head. I think it's the Federal Administration Act of 1958 or something like that. And what you will find is the primary driver in us getting the FAA was not this type of like hijacking problem. It was midair collisions. Because what we had discovered was if you don't know where other planes are in the sky, then there was an interesting possibility that like potentially you could run into one of those other planes. And one of those collisions had actually occurred in summer of 1956. And that's when a Lockheed Super Constellation slammed into a United Airlines Douglas DC-7 and 128 people died. And they went, oh, well, that's a problem.
Right. And it just took them long enough to get the legislation through, right? Because the United States puts a ton of money into the FAA and like international airline travel, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And so that was sort of like the beginning of that. I mean, it wasn't really the beginning. It was already they were trying to get it in place, but see, it had to be federal because the travel of planes is usually not only between states, but then between countries, right?
Right.
And you've got to have a consistent playing field.
Right. And like they made all of it federal basically for that reason, and the fact that like the skies were going to be federal, even if you're like traveling within a state, like you're still in the sky and you need to be tied into the systems of passing planes and planes going state to state.
So you don't crash into them.
Exactly. So yes, the FAA came out.
I always find the wisdom behind what we take for granted now, like, for example, the FAA. I always find that fascinating because, like, they literally went from, like, oh, let's build some planes. Let's fly some planes. Oh, now we've got to regulate flying of planes, right?
Yeah.
And to me, it's just fascinating that there was so much collective wisdom to kind of put things in place. Now, granted, we all take it for granted now, but it wasn't always that way, right?
Yeah, and this was one of those things that, like, the CAA was really designed, and I don't know what it says if you go read a summary of it, but it was really designed to make sure that people who were getting on planes and flying them with people, like, as their liability or responsibility, knew what they were doing. So the CAA being replaced by the FAA, it kind of suddenly became all-encompassing. The CAA had been basically making sure you had your driver's license for the sky, and then they realized, oh, that's not enough. So that's how we get the FAA. And I take it for granted too. But I will say, if you want a rabbit hole that's not really true crime related, looking at how between about 1948 and 1980, 85 maybe, looking at all the different government agencies that were created in that time and what spurred them to be created is fascinating.
It really is. Unfortunately, we're at the point now, in my opinion, that they went through a time where like it was very like strict and tight ship, and then it started kind of falling apart.
Right.
And now that's what has led me to reflect on it, like seeing all the problems that occur when like the ship isn't tight.
Oh, yeah.
And we're just pumping money into like endless nothing, basically.
Yeah, it's very disheartening because it's in some ways it's kind of like looking at an empire from the perspective of its golden age and then seeing what happens as that golden age unravels and it moves to a new era.
Exactly. That's exactly how I see it. But it takes that long to kind of reflect back.
It does. And one of the interesting things about the case that we're going to cover today is it's actually multiple cases. It's actually really and truly at its heart is a person.
Right.
That person's name is Garrett Brock Trapnell. Now, Garrett Trapnell, he was a con man. He was also a bank robber, and he himself was a hijacker. So he spent a lot of time in the 60s and 70s doing some really interesting stuff. But one of the most interesting things he appears to have done is he maintained marriages with at least 6 women simultaneously.
Which wasn't legal.
No, it's bigamy. But the fact that he's doing it at all is sort of, in my opinion, it makes it relatively clear that you're dealing with someone who is
Who's
very
unhinged.
smart, but also unhinged. Yep.
I believe we've talked about him before.
He's come up a couple of different ways. Yeah.
And I've said, like, I mean, I've been married one time, 20 years, and I think to myself, why would anybody want to be married to that many people?
Well, it sounds to me like, and I may be wrong on this, I think he used it as a means to an end so that he was always able to be somewhere else. Because among the other weird things he did, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that makes sense.
Yeah, he also frequently would pose as an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency.
He's a character.
He really is. And he pulled off a $100,000 jewelry store heist in Freeport, Bahamas, which is not that's not nothing considering the timing of it all.
Right. It would have been, it would have been a lot more now.
Correct. Yeah. January 28th, 1972, kind of in the middle of this hijacking time, Garrett Trapnell, using a .45 caliber pistol that he has smuggled inside a plaster cast, like an elbow cast on his arm, he manages to hijack TWA flight number 2 from Los Angeles to New York. And he waits until the plane is over Illinois to do this. Now, he demands $306,800 in cash, which happens to be the judgment in a recent court case that he had lost. He wants the release of Angela Davis, which is how he's come up with us talking about him in the past, because we talked at length about Angela Yvonne Davis in our Home for the Holidays series. And he also has on that list a friend of his who's in prison. But the thing that he wants the most is he wants a formal pardon from President Richard Nixon. Now, during a crew switch, when the plane lands at Kennedy Airport, the FBI takes over the plane. And Garrett Trapnell is shot and wounded. No one else is hurt. But this is one of those things that you were saying, could this be directly responsible for things within the FAA? It's not 1958 version, it's the 1972 version, but pretty much when he does this skyjacking, he is almost directly responsible for a massive overhaul in procedures by the FAA. And most of those procedures will remain in place. And if you were a 70s or an 80s kid, this is how you would remember flying on a plane, even into the 90s. But they will change again. And you mentioned this already in the September 11th attacks. That will be the first major overhaul that happens. So we have 1972 with Garrett Trapnell and this incident in January 28th. And then the next time will be the September 11th attacks, September 11th, 2001. That'll be the next big overhaul. In this instance, he pleads insanity. And he explains to the court that he suffers from multiple personality disorders and he has schizophrenia, and that the hijacking was not committed by Garrett Trapnell at all. It was committed by one of his alter egos named Greg Ross. So there's a lot of audio recordings out there. If you want to get into Trapnell, a lot of people have now started sharing those things. According to journalists who have interviewed him and his own voice, he has developed a skill, much like maintaining 6 wives and pulling off these grandiose things. And that skill is faking insanity. So this particular trial ends in a hung jury because there's a holdout on the jury, happens to be a social worker on the jury, and that person holds out for acquittal. So he's retried 4 months later, And he ends up being convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. And he is going to be one of the folks who, unfortunately, are going to be experiencing USP Marion. And USP Marion was the first federal supermax prison. So he's going to end up in there. But that's not the story for today. That's just how we get to the story for today. So on May 24th, 1978, so just over 6 years after that skyjacking, a 43-year-old woman named Barbara Ann Oswald hijacks a St. Louis-based charter helicopter. And she forces the pilot to land in the yard at USP Marion. So this is where Trapnell is serving his sentence. The pilot of the aircraft is a guy named Alan Barkledge. He's a Vietnam vet. He gets into a shoving match aboard the plane with Barbara Ann Oswald, and he gets the gun away from her. He then shoots and kills Barbara Oswald, which I have to say, like, in terms of all of this, it is very, very disheartening that, like, a death happens here.
Right, but the pilot wasn't in the wrong.
No, not at all. But it stops the escape in progress. And you would think that would be the end of our story.
Of course it isn't. You know, it's interesting because I know of at least like a couple of instances and at least movies where like there's been prisoners who have like dreamt of helicopters coming in to like get out of, and somebody's there to bust them out of jail, right?
Yeah.
And this is her actually doing that, or trying.
Correct. This is her actually doing that. Before we get to like the next part that happened, I'm gonna throw in like a piece of bizarre. There's a period of time, and I don't know if you remember that. The Huffington Post used to be like people could freely post there. And
I remember that.
Yeah, so I went back and I found an April 2010 post there. And this post was just interesting, so I'm including it as part of this. It says, fan mail from prison. And it says, it began when I was on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow, and I got a letter in my fan mail from Marion State Penitentiary, a brilliant letter filled with glorious poetry quoting Keats and Yeats and Shakespeare. And this is by Tina Sloan, who identifies as an actress and an author. And she says, a man named Garrett Brock Trapnell, who was a Brock from Brockton, Massachusetts, became my, quote, pen pal, end quote. In this case, could that be short for penitentiary? Question mark. It began when I was on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow, and I got a letter in my fan mail. It was a brilliant letter filled with glorious poetry quoting Keats and Yeats and Shakespeare from Marion State Penitentiary. You get the picture. I was enthralled, and I wrote him back with answering quotes. I told my husband, Steve, so apparently there's red flags on both sides of this equation, about this wonderful prisoner and where he was. And Steve suggested I stop writing him, as that prison is for lifers. But oh no, not me. We kept writing and discussing books and poetry and reasons for, quote, being, and became great friends. Garrett mentioned in a letter that I reminded him of his wife. Well, since he was a lifer, I wondered if he had murdered said wife, who I reminded him of. So, and I wonder which wife she reminded him of. Just saying. So I ran out.
He's a con man.
Right.
Just saying.
Yeah, 100%. So I ran out instantly to get the book he told me he had written about his life called The Fox is Crazy Too. It turns out he had 6 wives, all at the same time, and he and each wife belonged to country clubs up and down the East Coast. Needless to say, none of the wives knew about the other. He had a plane and would fly to Canada, where he was number 1 on the Royal Canadian Mounties Most Wanted list. He'd rob a bank in Canada dressed impeccably, and let me add, he never used a weapon, but pretended he had a gun inside a cast on his arm. After robbing the bank, he'd fly himself back to one of his many homes in the U.S. Now and then he would get caught. Then he would pretend he was insane and, quote, crazy like the fox, end quote, in the book title. He would get sent to a mental institution, and of course, his feigned insanity would instantly clear up. He was so brilliant, he always got away with it. On and on with his life until he finally, for some reason, I forget, hijacked TWA Flight 1, which was going around the world. He was captured for that rather small picadillo and sentenced to life in prison, from which he was writing me constantly and making my husband Steve very upset. Then one night, Steve and I were getting ready to go to sleep. We were half-heartedly listening to the news on the radio. There was a story about a prison breakout in, oh God, Marion, Illinois. Marion, Illinois, where my poet was. A small plane had landed in the prison yard, and my poet was escaping in the getaway plane that one of his 6 wives, one that looked like me, had landed there. My heart was pounding. Of course, my apartment would be the place to hide, a place where no one would think of looking for him. The perfect place to hide. Steve looked at me. I had said again and again, Steve, he will never get out of prison, so of course I am going to write him. He is so interesting, and on and on. Steve just kept looking at me. No, I told you so. He just looked, and I started to shake as Garrett and I were communicating all the time. We finally turned off the lights with no news as to whether Garrett and his, quote, wife had gotten away with it. The stations just kept repeating there had been a prison breakout. Steve slept, and I paced the apartment all night, checking for updates as to what was happening. And I kept imagining him and his wife flying through the air to land near New York City and arrive at our apartment. I had given him my home address so our letters could whiz back and forth faster than going through the CBS. I kept thinking of his last letters with glowing references to the fields of daffodils he yearned to see again. It was spring when a young man's fancy turns to love, and he was missing the poetry of nature in his prison cell. Oh. The next morning, it was announced the attempt to escape from the Marion State Penitentiary had failed. And since I'd never heard from him again, I had to believe he was put in solitary and not allowed to write me letters, since obviously, while he was quoting poetry to me, he was plotting a bold escape with her. He was sort of two-timing me. I thought that was hilarious. I don't know if it's true or not, but I do find like some of the stuff I've read about Garrett Trapnell hilarious.
I wonder, so my first thought was he was probably pen paling with like lots of people to throw off, like, because if he was just sending one set of letters to the person who, Barbara Ann Oswald, who ultimately was the one who tried to break him out, right?
Right.
The more people he was writing, the more they could have got lost in the shuffle, you know?
Right.
I don't know that they were screening mail back then.
No, that's the way they screen mail now is a relatively new phenomenon in terms of these type stories.
Okay. It's interesting, though, because he just couldn't help himself. And I'm not really sure what that soap opera was, because I guess it was back in before I was born, right?
Of course.
But he just literally took a shot by sending an actress a letter, right?
He did, yes.
And she responded. And her husband, can you imagine? I can totally imagine.
I can see the look on his face. Yeah,
exactly. Because he's going, man, I told her to stop doing that, but he didn't say it out loud, right?
Right.
And then, obviously she totally freaked out. And ultimately, it didn't end up mattering. But I can totally find I can. It's interesting.
Yes, and it doesn't get less interesting. And I bring all of that stuff up to say, on May 24th of 1978, we have this Barbara Ann Oswald attempting to get him out of USP Marion. Now, that is foiled by Alan Barklage, the Vietnam vet, shooting Barbara Ann Oswald. She dies at the scene, right?
Right.
From this story, another one of the inmates involved was a guy named Martin McNally. So he had hijacked St. Louis Tulsa American Airlines flight back in 1972, and he had demanded $500,000 before jumping out of a plane over Peru, Indiana. So keep that in mind that this is not a small thing that's going on. Like multiple people are involved. And I say that, and this is a side note I'm going to put out. Alan Barklage dies in a helicopter crash September 19th, 1998. I think he died that week, maybe. Martin McNally, that guy that was involved in this attempted breakout, he's going to finally be paroled January 27th of 2010. But going back to 1978 for a second, on December 21st, 1978, the 17-year-old daughter of Barbara Ann Oswald, Robin Oswald, hijacks TWA Flight 541, and she demands that Garrett Trapnell be freed, or she was going to detonate dynamite strapped to her body. So, according to all the hostages on this flight, she is very beautiful, she seems very serious, and she is not anxious, and she is not nervous. This is a 17-year-old girl.
She's vindicating her mom.
Yep.
I can see where that would have been a mission that would leave a 17-year-old girl with no fear.
Yeah.
But it's misguided.
It is incredibly misguided. And so, just to put it out there, the plane ends up landing. FBI negotiators, they free all the hostages, and they have Robin Oswald surrender. There's no injuries or death involved in this particular skyjacking. The bomb that was strapped to her chest, it turned out to be railroad flares wired with what appeared to them to be a doorbell. And they end up charging her as a juvenile. And I will say this for Illinois. We do not know very much about like what happened with her. And I could only find one good article on this. I don't know if you've read this. It comes out of the Kentucky New Era that same year, December 1978. And it just says, 17-year-old hijacks plane to free hijacker. It says that Robin Oswald, a 17-year-old high school dropout, hijacked a Transworld Airlines jet to free a man her mother loved and had died for. Today, Robin is in jail while authorities ponder whether to charge her as a juvenile or an adult. And U.S. Attorney James Burgess said a decision has not yet been made on what charge to bring or whether to bring it in state or federal court. He said she might be charged as an adult with air piracy or could be treated as a juvenile. She was to be transferred from a jail in, I think it's Benton, down to East St. Louis. Passengers aboard the TWA Flight 541, which is a DC-9 jetliner, said that she was a sweet-looking girl with blonde hair and curls, but her finger was firmly placed on what she said was a bomb, and she was angry. The hijacking lasted 10 hours Thursday until she surrendered. The bomb turned out to be a device rigged with flares. This is according to FBI agent Edward Hegarty. He said it could have done some damage, but would not itself have caused an explosion. According to Army Private Levi King in Seattle, who was on the flight, he said she was very beautiful, but I know she was serious, particularly when she yelled that she was going to blow the whole plane up. She kept talking about how her mother had died in a helicopter and her family had disowned her. I told her I've been in the same boat and that this was no way to take revenge, but she wouldn't listen. The girl, identified by the FBI as Robin Oswald, is a high school dropout from St. Louis. She had been demanding the freedom of convicted hijacker Garrett Brock Trapnell. Her mother was killed 7 months ago in another air piracy aimed at freeing Trapwell. Miss Oswald has been arraigned as a juvenile, but charges were not announced as is customary under Illinois law. No hearing date was set. And they kind of go on to describe like what we just talked about. I just want to point out, I don't think there's ever been another juvenile charged with air piracy or who's tried to take an airplane hostage for real.
Well, most juveniles wouldn't have a reason to.
Right.
I'm telling you that it's the drive. I think that he probably got to her and it was all about vindicating her mom. Right.
Yeah.
And, 17-year-olds, she didn't have a mother any longer.
Right.
I don't know about other parental rules or whatever, but I see this coming from a mile away. But most 17-year-olds wouldn't have it in them to do it because there's nothing that would light a fire under them figuratively to want to do something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I found a record for Robin Oswald that I think she would have been 18, so she might be too old. But I couldn't find any like records indicating that a Robin Oswald had been put in prison. Like,
Interesting.
so I don't know for sure if she was or was not imprisoned for this. I can only say that if you go and read about it, there are quite a few jurisdictional debates that happen in 1978 and 1979. Like, what do you do with the girl from St. Louis that took over a plane but is still a juvenile, which she's committed a crime that technically would be in adult court, but in the type of adult court that doesn't have a juvenile proceeding, because at the time there would have been very few air piracy proceedings of juveniles. I mean, there'd be none. There'd be zero. So, like, what do you do with this girl?
Well, there was no precedent, right?
Right.
And there was no like aftermath.
No.
There's no need for a precedent. In fact, I wouldn't encourage them to do it, but maybe if some of our 17-year-olds could like plan something as complicated, it would be impressive.
Yeah. Like that, it's actually fairly like organized, and like it sort of fits the insanity of all of this.
Well, right, exactly, because it is insane. And what do you do? I don't know what the answer is. Deprogram her?
I mean, potentially, but like she's not programmed by Trapnell. She's literally just doing what I think she perceives as this thing her mom was trying to do.
Well, right, but like that in and of itself requires I mean, imagine what their conversations were before her mom did that, right?
Right. Yes.
And so it is a certain amount of deprogramming. And like this dude, he had crazy game somehow, right?
Oh yeah, he did. I have no idea how that works.
Exactly. But he knew what to say. And so I could see where the fact that her mom died tragically doing something, I mean, I would say stupid, but she would say was like worthy, I imagine, because of the narrative that was being spun on that side of it.
Right.
This poor girl, she just, I do feel like there is going to be, to some extent, some deprogramming that has to happen so she can realize, like, oh, he was in jail because of our judicial process. The pilot was absolutely, like, while it's sad, the pilot, he didn't know what she was going to do,
Well,
as far as the mom,
right.
like, you know, what if she had wanted to free like all the prisoners or something? I don't know, but he wasn't in the wrong. It was terrible that her mom died that way, but she put herself in that position, right? And so I would say even Barbara Ann Oswald was a victim to some extent that could have used some deprogramming.
Yes. And I will say there's an article on hood.edu about Garrett Trapnell. It's called The Return of Dr. Jekyll. Towards the ending of that article, it had like one of the most interesting summations that I feel like not just applies to Trapnell. I think it applies to like everybody who was brought into this. And I want to throw it out there. It's a quote from the article itself. And the article, I'll just go ahead and say, does not have a writer on it. It's just like a news clipping from the Times. And it's taking place right in the middle of a paragraph talking about the fact that to this freelance writer, Cy Berlowitz, Trapnell has basically admitted, I was told by a lawyer that I either needed to go to like the world of the mental institutions or I was going to prison. And he basically said, well, I guess I'm going to the mental institution. How this shakes out is Assistant U.S. Attorney Peter Schlom, who's in charge of one of his trials, he brings in two psychiatrists to testify. And in their opinion, not only was Trapnell perfectly sane, but he had an IQ of 130. So the social worker that we talked about, she was the juror that like held out. Her name was Gertrude Haas. She had been working for about 30 years as a psychiatric social worker. And this was her summation of what was happening. For her professional eye to look at everything she saw, she said, Trapnell's account of how he had faked insanity was itself further evidence of actual insanity. And all of this, these people are all living in like a soap opera.
I don't disagree with that.
Even the
for real.
daughter.
But it is an interesting concept, right?
I see that all the time, and I agree with her. Like, that's the best way I've heard it summed up.
Because initially, somewhere way back at the beginning of the story, you said something like he pretend to be insane. And my thought is, like, is he the only one who thinks he's pretending?
I understand people want to go, oh, he's a criminal, which he is. But like those two things notwithstanding, like I think the behavior and the level of crimes he was committing are insane. And
They are. And like the only, just because he's said, oh, I'm going to pretend to be insane to like, I don't know. I don't see how he's getting away with it. Cause even if you go to the insane ward of being incarcerated, it's not getting away with something, right?
yeah.
I don't think. And it's interesting though, because that was my immediate thought when that came up. Like, oh, it was during, I think, the pen pal letters, where he explained he did all these crazy, things that he wanted to do, and then he just pretended to be insane. Well, I got news for you, buddy. I don't think you're completely pretending.
No, not at all. I don't think he was ever pretending. I will say he has kind of unceremonious death. He ends up dying of emphysema because honestly, like in the federal prisons at the time, he would have been in them. Really, all you had to do all day was read and smoke. There was not a lot of programming back then, but he makes his way over to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, and September 7th, 1993, he dies of emphysema. That is very unceremonious. And I, for the life of me, have not figured out how to track down Robin Oswald. I've tried several different times because I would be totally curious to see what, if anything, she did next. You know what I mean?
I'm going to go with she probably changed her name.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I was like, I think like among the first things I would want to do since I would be 17 and like this was basically the equivalent of my entire permanent record. I know that permanent records aren't real. I'm just being tongue in cheek. That like this would be the thing that would set me towards a name change petition.
Yes, exactly. And that's why we're probably never going to find her.
No, I assume so. But this story is like one of those that if you're talking about hostage taking, you kind of have to talk about skyjacking. And if you talk about skyjacking, you have to talk about Garrett Trapnell. And this is sort of the button on his story. Like the last big thing that occurs is Robin Oswald trying to like get him freed by strapping road flares to her chest and like declaring she has a bomb. I find it fascinating. I find the whole era that we have of skyjackings and how they're gone now to be so interesting.
It's fortunate they did something about it then. Can you imagine the technological evolution? And because if you think about it, the September 11th events, the last major overhaul was in 2001.
Right.
And we were at the very beginning of the technological evolution, right?
Yes.
Can you imagine if the overhaul hadn't happened before that?
Yeah, it would be crazy.
It would be crazy. And it's interesting to me that we sort of beat that. I guess we'll see what happens, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I have this short story I wrote that I decided I wanted to write about the first hijacking in space. And so that's where I'm at. I'm like, what will the next frontier of this type of thing? Because, like, I think we've settled into an age where it's, like, really easy to basically take people's money from their phone. And, like, that's where we're at now is trying to trick older people who are not familiar with technology into giving us their money over the phone.
So what does it say that, like, all of the potential, like, hijackers became spammers, scammers.
I mean, ultimately, they kind of did. And a lot of bank robbers, too.
Well, it's not great. It's not great.
No.
I don't understand a lot of that. It's a weird concept, but that's kind of how I feel like it landed.
It did, yeah. We're only about halfway through. Well, a little more than halfway. We've got several more episodes for Home for the Holidays. You got anything else on technology and skyjacking and shrapnel and Robin Oswald?
No, I feel like we covered it. This is always an interesting case with so many facets.
Yeah, it's got so many rabbit holes to go down.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabrottieCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS. True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through Patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at TrueCrimeAccess.com. Thank you for joining us.